So it's cold here, falling rain, and, that's how some people might feel that Linda McMahon was nominated for the Secretary of Education position in the second Trump administration. I'm going to share a little bit about what I think that means. I'm going to share a little bit about whether or not we're going to see student loans raw and student loans smackdown in the next 4 years. Sorry for the jokes, but, you try to keep it light. So Linda McMahon as Secretary of Department of Education would have a lot of implications, but I still actually don't think it's something to panic over, and let me tell you why. So if you think about, Linda McMahon compared to Betsy DeVos, who was the last Secretary of Education, appointed by the Trump administration, Betsy DeVos and Linda McMahon, what they share in common is that they're both major donors to the Trump campaign, right? And also, interestingly, for student loan borrowers, when they announced her pick, what they said is that she's going to return education back to the states. That's going to be her job at Department of Ed. So notice that they did not say absolutely anything about student loans in her announcement whatsoever. That's kind of interesting because that tracks with the first term of the Trump administration, which they didn't care about student loans. They didn't prioritize it at all. They didn't think about it at all. They didn't really talk about it all that much. They put a couple proposals forward, but none of them had any power because they couldn't get any consensus to pass them. And then they didn't do really any executive actions besides pausing all student loan payments and interest during the CARES Act period, during the early part of the pandemic, right? So Linda McMahon as, Secretary of Education, you could probably make up a bunch of jokes and one-liners about that. It's kind of wild that the person leading Department of Ed is like a professional wrestler executive. But, that's kind of expected if you look at the other picks for the Trump administration, So I think that for student loan borrowers, the key here is just to be calm, to recognize that, so far at Department of Ed, we're watching the sequel of the same movie. And, there are some negative implications for borrowers who are depending on certain programs with this. So things like borrower defense to repayment. In the first Trump administration, that got ground to a halt. Very few things got approved. Almost nothing got approved, frankly. And I would expect the same thing would happen under a Secretary McMahon in Department of Education. I don't think you'd see really any, defrauded borrowers get approved, or very few at least. Borrower defense would grind to a halt. A lot of the administrative problems that plagued Department of Ed in the first term for Trump would be the same in the second term for Trump. And what we can hope that this pick signals is a lack of seriousness about paying attention to what the Biden administration did on student loans, frankly. Because the Biden administration did so much and yet implemented it so poorly that we are waiting around for the IDR account adjustment with like 2 months to go before the administration switches over. We're also waiting on borrower defense to repayment claims to go through. We're waiting on the SAVE plan lawsuits to go through. So, the Biden administration essentially promised a bunch of things, gambling that they would be so popular and that they would win a second term that they could keep them going. Now, with the Trump administration, with a Secretary Linda McMahon running Department of Ed, that is something that is questionable in terms of how much of this will go through. I actually think the vast majority of it will go through. I think that people that have problems will have to appeal those problems. They will have to submit complaints to FSA. I think mostly a Department of Education run by Linda McMahon is going to just not be paying attention to a lot of the things that were done by the Biden administration, and so borrowers are going to have to be their own best advocates to figure out how much credit should I actually have towards income-driven repayment? How much credit should I have gotten when I consolidated my loans in 2022 or 2023 during that IDR account adjustment period, right? For PSLF borrowers, how do I advocate for myself for the PSLF buyback and make sure it actually happens, right? So a lot of these things, we're just going to have to monitor the situation. I do think that probably Linda McMahon would get approved by the Senate. I don't think that there's anything that would be shocking or particularly controversial that would cause her to not be nominated or not be confirmed. So I guess get ready for, all the Department of Education folks now are going to be switched over to 1099 contractors, and they're going to lose all their health insurance, right? And, you could write the jokes, if you're, if you know anything about professional wrestling, it's just kind of wild. But, this is the world we live in, right? So you just got to adapt, and you've got to just think through, what does this mean for my loans? The good news in this situation is what it means for your loans is more of the same from the first Trump administration. So if you got through that first Trump administration with your student loans, you're fine for the second Trump administration based off of what we're seeing so far, based on them picking Linda McMahon for Secretary of Education. So any questions or concerns about anything with Department of Ed, put them in the comments. Thank you for following Student Loan Planner.